Really looking forward to our conversations today. I actually worked in Greece in 2016, 2015, 2016, and I'm just really interested to hear and find out more about what has been happening since then, working with the displaced population. And so today's session is going to be looking at equity-based design thinking in education. We're going to be unpicking what this means, and we're also going to be talking about some of the terms around decoloniality. And the idea is to be as interactive as Zoom permits. So please, if you do have questions, feel free to ask throughout or put them in the chat. And we're also going to have a couple of breakout sessions as well. So it'll be a chance to have a bit more kind of in-depth conversation. But yeah, so today I'll start with a kind of brief introduction, and then we'll talk about inequity and how this plays out in the education programmatic design. Again, yeah, I'll go through what this concept is, and then we'll start thinking about how this may or may not be applicable to the work that you do. And just to give you a bit of background to who I am, yeah, so my name's Jess. I've spent about 10 years working in the humanitarian aid space. Predominantly working as an education and emergencies practitioner. And this was really just coming from my background as a secondary school teacher. I worked as a secondary school teacher and a youth worker in the UK. And I've since worked, since I've been working in this field, I've worked from very small grassroots organisations to international non-governmental organisations like Save the Children, Lutheran World Federation, War Child, around the world, and also the UN agencies, so like the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And I recognise that there's so many acronyms, and so one of the things I'll be doing is spelling these out as much as possible. And if someone's not familiar with the term, please again just let me know. I'm also a Ph.D. student at the University of East London, where I teach on a open learning higher education program, which is a preparation course for refugees and asylum seekers. We're actually part of a network which has a partner institution in Greece, in Thessaloniki, I believe, who have a similar program. And again, if anyone has any questions about this or be interested, just let me know at the end. And I'll also be talking about ways that you may be interested in finding out more about the research, which focuses on young people's, diverse young people's experiences of education in South Sudan, Jordan, and the UK, and if colonial legacies continue to dominate and shape the ways that programming is designed for youth. And finally, I'm also, I work as a consultant and equity EIE consulting. So enough about me. Today we're here to talk about designing programs. And I think COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement last year has really re-energized some of the long-standing critiques about how the humanitarian, well, it's raised so many issues across every single sector, but particularly the humanitarian sector and also education. And I wondered if anyone would like to share what they think decolonization, or to decolonize, what does this mean, or how do you understand it? And feel free to share using your audio, or if you want, you can pop your ideas in the chat.
I'll jump in then, seeing as there's a bit of a silence, and I like filling silences. Hello, my name is Jalal. So I think decolonization really in this context means recognizing that our experiences of education and the things that come from that and contribute to our worldview do not necessarily give us a balanced view of what the experience is in the global south, what the causes behind the situations that, you know, as humanitarians we purport to help with, what the causes are behind those, and the culpability that our own sort of countries and institutions have in that. and just sort of having this very Eurocentric view of the world that has a bit of, you know, if we're going to be honest about it, a bit of an assumed notion of superiority. And I think that decolonizing is about thinking critically to question that and to unravel it a bit, because it's not something that we are trained to do. As well, I say we, me as a British person who was educated here and has grown up here.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. And I have a couple of questions about some of the terms you use. So when you mentioned the global south, what is the global south?
Yeah, it's a bit of a sketchy label, isn't it? So I think what I mean when I say the global south really is poor countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, we've got somebody in the chat saying something. Yeah, so yeah, you're right. So when we hear this term used quite a lot, we're referring to poor countries, and when we think about why these countries are poor, there's often a history of coloniality or colonialism in those contexts. And it was really interesting what you said about, you know, we have this maybe Eurocentric view, assumed notion of superiority, and this idea that knowledge that originates from a certain geographical place is more valued than other places. And then just got some comments in the chat from Basilici. Where's the chat gone? To add to that, maybe because I'm struggling to read the chat at the same time, if anyone wants to jump in on the mic as well, that's also fine.
I can read Basilici's comment if you can't see it.
Thank you.
We've got from Basilici, decolonize is about dependence/independence, inferior/superior, and other dichotomies we need to address and decode, and much more. And then Sammy has put possibly moving away from assumptions of a lingua franca that is common to all.
Yeah. Thank you for those contributions. And again, like I wanted to start with is also like just unpacking some of these terms, because as Sammy says, like they mean different things to different people. And for me, I mean, there's so much literature out there, and today is just a very brief introduction, and I will be sharing like links if people want to dig into this more. But when we hear of this term colonization versus coloniality, when we're talking about colonialism, this is often kind of geographic and time bound, and we think about it as a period of when people were controlled by one power over you know, another group of people or area, and then we associate this with imperialism. And we have to be really mindful that, you know, many countries, not just countries in Europe, have histories of colonialism. But when we're thinking about these literatures and when we're seeing these references, it's often referring to the history of European colonialism over huge parts of the world. And coloniality then is the kind of legacy of this. And I think it links to one of the comments that were made, that it shapes the way that we think about things. It shapes the way that we value knowledge. And this still has a legacy. And so when we're thinking about decolonization, we obviously heard this a lot in the past when, you know, countries were decolonized in the 60s and 70s. But decoloniality then is again thinking about how we challenge and change our ways, and acknowledge, but we must also acknowledge, like, this is something that isn't going to happen overnight. It's very long term, it's multifaceted, and we need to think about it in multiple languages and levels, and just be very mindful that everything is related to kind of direct action to transform kind of institutional, structural, and the kind of legacies of colonialism. So again, a very brief introduction to the terminology, but I hope, yeah, I hope we will kind of gain in kind of shared understanding about how this is kind of conceptualized. And so just thinking about your roles or your interest in this topic, I'd be really interested to know, like, why do you think decoloniality is a particularly relevant topic to discuss when working in the field of education and working with displaced communities? And again, feel free to add to the chat, and Olivia can can share, or use your mic.
I started typing, but I gave up because I'm really slow. So I prefer talking. But
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that it's very important is that recognizing, well, speaking as a formerly a European, but speaking as a British person, I think recognizing the role that that my country has played in destabilizing parts of the world where people are being displaced from can really make a difference in terms of how empathy works when you're working with people who have been displaced. You know, I think that it also helps to counter, again, this kind of sense that I feel, you know, we're trained, I you know, was brought up with and trained with, which is that, you know, the reason that these countries are unstable or conflict ridden is their own fault. And that, I think, brings, again, a sense of a dynamic of inferiority, superiority. And I think that can lead people working in these contexts to almost infantilize the people that they're working with, which really, you know, really, I think, is in the long term not very helpful at all.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, just thinking, it's interesting, like, again, how it connects to education, and how when we think we've all grown up, we're all influenced by, you know, the educational experiences have shaped us, and the knowledges that have been shared with us, and how that, again, yeah, influences our worldview. Any other comments or contributions?
There is
Yes, there is
something
a sense in discussions on this topic to think there's, okay, I'm a British person, I am becoming more enlightened about my own history and about how to interact with people from different parts of the world. And then to think almost unconsciously that I am bringing this enlightenment to other people. And then that can have an effect of the inferiority, superiority dichotomy again. It is, I find it very difficult to kind of, how to keep a balance, how to, in a sense, push down where I'm coming from, and then to ask questions whether I should or shouldn't. And I find that I find the process not easy and extremely difficult. But having worked in different countries, I find that despite my efforts to understand, I find I'm also at the same time bringing a lot of my own baggage with me that I just simply cannot get rid of.
Some really interesting observations there, Sammy. And actually, we're going to do an exercise a bit later, which I hope you all enjoy, but is particularly relevant to your point around thinking about the things that we bring with us and how that can open up spaces, but also how it can also influence the way that we shape and respond to certain problems. So yeah, really, really interesting and honest contributions there. Thank you. And I'll click on the chat, which will pop up on the screen for everyone. And yeah, we've just got some great contributions here. Again, you know, thinking about what we're teaching, how we're teaching it. Again, English teaching is prevalent, but should we be critical of that? Assumptions around the texts that we're giving children or students, maybe adult learners as well. And also, yeah, there's lots of things that are so relevant, particularly to education, when we're thinking about the way that knowledge plays an important role in shaping worldviews and the kind of legacies of colonialism and how they can resurface in the classroom. It's also really important to note, and we won't go into it a lot in this presentation just for time, but there's also a lot of people who push back on this concept of decoloniality, and for very different reasons, and who feel that actually this isn't relevant, and critique it. And so that's also an interesting thing to explore as well. But I'm a firm believer in that coloniality exists, and that we do need, particularly in the sector that I've worked in, that we do need to look at decolonizing some of the systems and structures and institutions. And I found this quote from a presentation, and it touches on, you know, many of the comments that have been made. But when we think about decolonizing education, it could mean about changing education priorities. So again, fighting against this systemic erasure of Indigenous people's truths, values, worldviews, knowledges, ways of life, education, literature, and learning. So even thinking about, you know, the concepts and how we just define education is very much, again, coming from a certain position. So when we think about these colonial legacies in education, but also in humanitarian aid or international development work, there's been a lot of writing around this in the past year. And I thought this is a really great quote by Wale Offerson, who works for the International Rescue Committee. And he, you know, really highlights like who gets to be an expert in a sector is often linked to colonial hierarchies of knowledge. And he talks about how the intersections around race, gender, social class, and the passport you hold can really determine how you're valued in the humanitarian sector specifically, and whether your ideas will be taken seriously or not. But I think this is also relevant to many, many contexts that we work. And that because of the unequal power dynamics that shape these institutions, very often the people, like maybe the implementing partner, but also the people who, the crisis affected communities, you know, have very limited scope to be included in all the phases of the project design, to negotiate budgets, to provide critical feedback. And I think this is really, really apparent if you're working for, you know, small community-based organizations, grassroots organizations. I think the power dynamics have come through very, very clearly, and quite obviously, and quite obvious as well. Any thoughts about that, or would anyone like to add anything before we move on? Okay. And so there's a huge cost to this exclusion. We know that power imbalances can lead to feelings of misunderstanding, to feelings of being treated unfairly, to friction, and a lack of trust. And then even this term expert, we know that it carries an unstated assumption that these are two separate groups, assumptions about their roles and responsibilities and assumptions about capabilities. So when we're thinking about experts, we're very often not thinking about the actual people who are the recipients of the said program. We're not thinking about the people who actually have lived experience of being displaced. And we see that this inequity begins to surface, and these power imbalances and these feelings of resentment, because whilst humanitarians are trying to design inclusive programs, very often the right people aren't in the room, which is of course very detrimental in contexts where there's resistance and suspicion towards outside interventions, but it also is detrimental in all contexts, because we often see the projects that we design, you know, may not be inclusive of all. And so what's really important is that we start to see the process as important as the product. Like how we get there is really, really key. The other thing I'm really interesting is this concept of, or this approach called design thinking. I wondered if anyone has heard of this before, or has worked on some programs that have used design thinking. If you have, please, yeah, feel free to share in the chat or to use your mic.
Is this like the model of like building and testing, and like the idea is that you don't wait until you think you have like a perfect product, but you just keep repeating iterations of different designs and seeing which works, and like the more you fail the better, almost? Is that the same kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. Have you worked on a project that's applied design thinking?
You kind of like, or the theory of it.
And how was that?
Well, I think my experience of it was kind of like we didn't have long enough to test enough kind of iterations of something, so it felt quite rushed. But I can see in theory that how it could work in the long run. But yeah, I haven't got that much experience with it. I just
no, that sounds great. And I think this concept of time as well is really important, because often when we do these programs and we're responding to emergency or an emergency, there's a very rushed process, and it's again thinking about we need to spend more time in the beginning to make sure that we're really building programs that are going to serve and benefit, you know, the people or who have been affected by the crisis. And so design thinking is very much, yeah, it's about building programs or projects. You normally start from a position of research, so getting the data, finding out, reading, you know, analyzing the data to find out where your kind of users' problems exist, generating ideas from that, doing the prototyping or testing, as you said, Olivia, testing it, getting the feedback, changing, adapting the program or project or the product, and then, you know, doing it again. And so there are definitely similarities with how in the humanitarian sector or international development sector, how programs are designed. And I've got up a picture. This is from OCHA, it's kind of a standard program cycle. But I think, again, it may be relevant to projects maybe that you've been developing and working with in Greece, where often you start with, you know, a needs assessment or analysis. So you'll go out and you'll consult with people, you'll consult with, you know, displaced populations. You'll analyze that data. That will inform the program. That will go into your concept notes, your proposals. If you secure the funding, then you start implementing. You'll do the monitoring and the evaluation, which is when you may go back and consult with the affected population again. And then, yeah, the evaluation. And so, yeah, this is a cycle that I've seen very much in international non-governmental organisations when responding to situations of displacement. And there's some comments in the chat. I don't know, Olivia, if you could take a look. Yes. Any additions?
I think we've got a question here from Liz. My question / concern about these frameworks is that it's still so easy to apply them, but as a checkbox exercise, and just use them to confirm your pre-existing, perhaps colonial assumptions? How do we actually make sure they're not just used as checkbox exercises?
Yeah, so great question, Liz, and I think that's very much what is often done as a checkbox, and that often the consultation with people who've been affected by the crisis is often only once or twice in the whole project cycle. So during the needs assessment, the kind of gathering data, and then during the monitoring and evaluation, in terms of getting people's views and opinions. And what we really need to be doing, if we really want to address these kind of imbalances, is to start embedding equity from the very, very beginning, and to make sure that we try and minimize or mitigate this influence. And we're going to do some exercises to practice doing this. But one of the key things is that, you know, we should be applying like an equity lens throughout, just thinking about our policies, outcomes, the power, the relationships and the solutions, to try as much as possible to eliminate any type of oppression. And so there has been a lot of critique, as Liz says, of these models. And one framework, which I think is really great and what we'll be working with today, is called equity-based design thinking, where a group of designers, they said, actually, design thinking is great. We love the idea of, you know, this testing and you know, adapting the program, but there's still this divide in terms of who gets to do that. And that also we need to be thinking from equity, and also thinking about how racism comes into play in design thinking, and could potentially shape the way that programs and solutions are proposed. And so there's I've given some references there of two different frameworks. Professor Leslie Ann Knowles, like, she's written a lot about emancipatory design thinking, and then the framework we're going to look at now by Carolyn Ortiz Molitor, and it is specifically used in school systems. So to begin with, if we're starting from the very, very beginning, we need to be thinking about who is present at each stage of the project and why. We need to be thinking about who gets to say how a problem is framed, or even if it's a problem at all. So if we're doing that initial kind of needs assessment, yeah, who's involved in designing the questions, who's involved in collecting the information, who's involved in analysing that data. And again, thinking about that framework, if we did design at the margins, we would be designing programs that include it, were much more inclusive. And the second thing to do that, though, we need to be really aware of who we are, and start with self. And so this kind of links to Sammy's point earlier, that everyone, regardless of age, race, ethnicity, nationality, or other kind of intersectional markers, should be aware that we all have individual biases, and we also all have levers of privilege, which enable us to see or not see things. And so if we want to be kind of thinking and designing from an equity-based, we need to be self-reflecting on who we are, how we ended up in that position, and what our position is relative to privilege and oppression in that context. So, for example, yeah, in all aspects of your identity, so race, class, gender, nationality, caste, religion, language, disability, how do these parts of your identity, what does that mean in your work, in that context, and how could levers of privilege, so where you do have privilege, how could that sometimes come and dominate the design process? And so to do this, we're going to do a little bit of a reflective exercise. So Olivia's going to put you into some breakout rooms, and we're going to share some links to a Jamboard. We're going to spend 10 minutes there's 2 questions to look at, and in your breakout rooms during the 10 minutes we'll have some reflections around the questions that come up, and again you can participate in that in however you like. If you want to just write on the Jamboard, you can. If you want to use your mic, that's also fine. So bear with us as we get you into the jam rooms. The Jamboard, you know what I mean. The breakout rooms with the Jamboards.
I like the idea of a jam room, actually.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great.
Okay, how many rooms would you like, Jess?
So we've got 21. Should we have 5 in each?
Yeah.
5 and, yeah. No. 3 5s and a 6.
Okay, I'll try my best. Okay, and are we going to post the links?
Yeah, I can do that. I've just stopped sharing. And so we've got 4 rooms, haven't we? And so, yeah. You just bear with us as you get your room.
Okay, I'll assign them, and then hopefully you'll be able to click on the links in the chat that are relevant to your room. We'll see.
Yeah.
Do you want to be in a room, Jess, or not?
I could be I can float around if you like.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, you can
I'll just put
us.
you in one for now. Okay.
Okay.
Open all rooms. Okay, you've been invited to join a breakout room, or you should have been.
Yeah, if everyone can copy and paste their link. So if you your group 1, Jamboard 1.
Where am I? Eleni, are you there?
Nice to meet you.
Oh, Olivia's in. Maybe she can help us.
You have the.
Hello, Olivia.
Did any of you get the link? Okay.
Yes,
No.
I can share again in the group chat.
You know how many of these breakout rooms I've done, and I can never. So,
I've got a link. Group 4, I take it.
yeah, you guys are you're group 4.
Okay.
So maybe if one of you can click on the link and then.
I'm just opening it now. Oh yeah, I've got it.
Okay.
It says start with a round of introductions, asking each member of the group to introduce themselves and motivation for joining the meetup.
Okay, guys, I'm going to go into the other room.
You don't need to record.
They're okay.
You don't need
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Joycelyn. I'm a research associate at the University in
Motivation for joining the meetup. Yes. So I was working with Olivia in Greece, in Skaramangas, the camp there. And so I've sort of tried to stay connected because I think there's always a part of me that plans to return to Athens somehow, but I don't know what that looks like at the moment. And so I like to, this is how I stay in contact with people via social media and via these learning seminars, which I find just amazing. And yes, thank you for last week, Sammy. Oh, the week before. I don't remember. The week before. Exactly. So I'm really enjoying, I guess, building myself from afar.
Do you guys all have the link to the jam room thing?
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
I just came in to check you were okay.
Oh, you should have seen our problems before. Yes, we've all got the group 1 link. Thanks, Liv.
Okay, great. Have fun.
Thanks.
A bit my area of interest and work. So I work in education and education for refugees. Mostly now I'm in the UK, but still interested in the topic. So yeah, here we are. And Liz.
Yes, thank you. My name is Liz. I also don't really have an interesting story about my name. My full name is Elizabeth. I'm based in Jordan, and the most frequent comment I get is, "Oh, the Queen," which I just never really know how to like respond to that. But yeah, I'm based in Jordan. I'm basically an education consultant. And yeah, I also just really enjoy these refugee ed webinars. I was also on the one 2 weeks ago with Sami and Manoli as well, it seems. And yeah, I like thinking new thoughts about education. And for better or worse, we have a curfew in Jordan starting right about now each evening. So I am trapped inside. So this is a ideal way to spend my curfews on Tuesday evenings.
Well, I'm sure Olivia is happy to continue obliging you with these. Thank you, Olivia. Okay, nice to meet you all, and note that everyone's got a very different background to you, which is cool. Shall we go to A for each person, which is one way your identity or position gives you privilege in your work?
And so this we are supposed to write on the Jamboard.
Yeah, look, whether you want to dictate it, and I'm happy to scribe it, or if you would like to write it in yourself. Liv, how much time do we have? Do you know?
We have like 7 minutes. I just thought I'd join your room because I didn't want to sit in a lonely room. So I can scribe if you want to talk. Is that okay?
Oh, great. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, jump in there.
Secretary.
I'll throw something in here, and that's as someone presently working and living in Lisbon, though the same was very much the case in Athens. Just as a native English speaker, I have incredible privileges, and I have been able to enter a workplace so easily, and I don't have to think about many things that right now in Lisbon. I'm helping people write CVs and translate them into English. And there are so many things that I guess I have considered before as an English teacher, but the more you're doing this, the more you realize the difficulties of not being native in a particular language that's becoming more and more and more prominent in absolutely everything. So I think that was the most obvious privilege of mine, being born in Australia and being able to work purely because I speak the language that I speak. I've got a lot of friends here, from Brazil, who are not able to get to positions of research or other particular things because of a language that I was born speaking.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I think it's crazy how much you can get away with by speaking English.
Yeah. It really very much feels like that. So I'll say that for A for me.
Yeah, I've got that. Sammy, do you want to go next? You're next on my list.
Well, just following up on what Manoli said, I was trained in teaching English at International House. That was about 30 years ago. And at the time, there were two kinds of certificates, one for first language English users and one for second language English users. First language English users, their certificate enabled them to work in many different countries. Second language English users who have the certificate through the same training are only allowed to teach, or were only allowed to teach, English in their home country. So at International House, which seems a bit of a dichotomy in terms of name, they produced a kind of two-tier certificate system. That's changed now. And what I found certainly in Central Europe is that learners much prefer to have people from their own region teaching them, because they are far more familiar with the difficulties that they are going through in learning English. They understand the problems that their compatriots are having with learning the English. And they much prefer that than having the so-called NABA teachers, North America, UK, Australian-based teachers. And that's a very interesting development. But anyway, about me, as I put down, yes, working as a university tutor in China, there is a very kind of a kind of prejudice towards the UK as being somehow, by virtue of being British, more noble. Somehow having a certain a kind of humanity that and this is what many Chinese students would tell me. They would say, "Oh, you're from Britain, Sammy. You're obviously a gentleman." I said, "Far from it." But that's one example of where I've noticed that where I come from somehow automatically put me in a position of power.
I've got,
we've got a university. Sorry?
We've got like 2 more minutes, so I just wanted to get the other.
All right. Okay, let me pass on. Liz, go on. Over to you. I'll pass you the ball.
Virtually take the ball. So similar to what you both have said, I mean, I'm American, and I mean, the fact that I'm based in the Middle East, and I've also spent time working in Afghanistan, it drives home kind of the passport privilege of, you know, I can leave, I can go somewhere else, and also have the money to do so. And a lot of my friends and colleagues from the Middle East, from Afghanistan, you know, can't. And, you know, they are smart people, they're wonderful people, but just by virtue of their passport and where they were born, they are not permitted to cross the border into a different country, often despite the immense danger they may be in.
Mm. Yeah,
So
that's true.
Julia.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add. I mean, there are of course infinite possibilities, but yeah, I was also thinking about holding a EU passport. I work with young refugees. Each time I'm saying, oh, yeah, I'm going home for Christmas. I'm seeing my family. And that's just something huge because they cannot leave, they cannot go back home, they cannot see their families. So that's what a passport question, rights, and potentially also what happened before or after they have left their own country. That puts me in a complete different position, although I'm also a migrant, I'm also a foreigner in the UK, but on all other terms compared to them.
Yeah, cool. I think that's all we have time for, guys. Sorry.
Yeah,
hopefully we can.
We could just bubble on forever. So.
Yes.
Okay, right.
Okay, we're back.
Are we the first ones back?
It seems to be the case. I blame Olivia.
I just wanted to see you guys. You're my favorite. No, I'm joking. They're coming back. They should be. They have 5 seconds left. So yeah, there we go.
Well, that breakout rooms method really worked really well, Olivia.
Good. Whew.
Yeah. Oof, yes.
Very stressful.
Hi, everyone.
Tuesday.
Hello, Jess.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing in the breakout rooms. I'm mindful of time, so we won't have much reflection on the reflection, But I hope that it was just, a really nice opportunity to meet other people who are working in this area, but also to think about how, our own positions, our own privileges, but also our own aspects of our identities, which may oppress us in certain contexts, could potentially come out in the way that we deliver programs, or even beyond programs, the way that we kind of navigate and interpret the world. So we're going to move on to the next part of equity, of the equity-based framework. And it comes, so one of the steps that they suggest is that, okay, once once there has been this critical reflection around, positionalities, this is a really good idea about who else you need to be involving in the projects from the very beginning, and what sort of adaptations you need to make sure you have a really diverse and inclusive team from the beginning. And they talk about this concept of like ceding power. So they argue that actually those people at the margins should be the ones who hold the most power in the design process. And that doesn't mean that, for example, just because you haven't, you've been fortunate you haven't been displaced, doesn't mean you don't have anything to offer. But it does call for us to kind of radically rethink these expert roles, and then to really recognize that the process is as important as the product, and listening. And to do this could mean thinking about, okay, when we're looking even things like funding, who are we engaging with? Are we tapping into diaspora communities, which have huge important roles in supporting community efforts? And it's definitely something I've seen coming from working in the INGO background, that because INGOs are not diverse, they often do not know or think about these other communities and horizontal networks which could support projects. It could also mean thinking about, if we're highlighting advocacy issues, how are we, who's setting these agendas? How are we kind of looking at or engaging with local, national, regional and policymakers and practitioners about these priorities? And also, how are the crisis affected populations framed or others in these calls? And so part of my PhD research, I've been doing a lot of investigations, research around, how young people are represented, and it's, more times than not in quite a kind of deficit approach, like highlighting vulnerability and victims and traumatization, which again can form part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And we often don't think about kind of agency, and or we don't see that representations of agency in these reports. And then when we're thinking about ceding powers, there's some practical things like thinking about establishing strategic advisory groups, or talking to the local communities and find out what their kind of community engagement traditions may be. And I think this is really important with education, particularly when you're working with young people, but actually it's relevant for all groups, like having a strategic advisory group made up of the people who have been affected by the crisis can really be more than just making sure you're not just doing the box checking, that people, have critical roles in inputting, reviewing, monitoring and challenging the programs that are being delivered. And that they are actually what people want. And so again, just maybe feel free to share in the chat, or if anyone would like to use their mic to share, what ways do your programs, or have you come across programs that engage and enable crisis affected people to be involved in decision making? Has anyone seen any great examples or currently, that does that?
might have an answer to that. I hope it's okay to not turn my video on.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I work with single men in Athens in a housing project, and we have a lot of discussions around the idea of independence, for example, and what that means. Obviously, there are certain goals for the organization in terms of what independence means as a resident moves on to being able to live on their own. But what we have come to see is that obviously everyone is different. And so independence actually means something different for everyone. Independence can be someone learning basic English language in order to get them, through the city, which is something they might have not been able to do before. Or independence can mean getting a job and being able to save enough money to get your own apartment. And so the spectrum is so diverse, and it's, what we try to establish is both a meter for ourselves and for them to see what they can gain out of the project from us, as opposed to what we want them to get from the program. And obviously it's a bit of a difficult balance, because again, you need to have certain outcomes, but yeah, it's through the process, it's definitely been a conversation that we've had to have over and over again.
Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like a really, really interesting project, and that kind of continuous engagement is key. And I think it also just highlights like some of the challenges we have, and I say we, those of us who are working in NGOs or NGOs around this expectation. Like often, the programs are expected to have certain outcomes, or there might be a pressure from a donor. I know like some of the donors I've worked with have set indicators, which again makes it very, very challenging if you're trying to have these participatory approaches, because there's again this assumption around what the outcome of that project should be. But I think it's really, I think there's so many wonderful practices around community engagement, and just I just encourage you all to share in the chat or connect, and I'd also love to hear more. So I will be sharing my contact details at the end if anyone has specific questions. So we're just going to move on to the next couple of points. So the other thing that the equity-based design framework calls for is to make the invisible invisible. So we know that and I think you also highlighted that, Chloe, in your point that you have this kind of diverse group of young men, but we know that factors such as the type of the emergency, maybe the young people on the move, they're not planning to stay in Greece for long, their country of origin and their previous experiences of education, disability, language, age, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, parenthood, how we know these intersect with gender and age to influence the types of experiences young people will have in these programs. And so how do we try and address those most at risk of falling through the cracks? It can be done in a number of ways. But I think again it's about looking at the very beginning about who's a part of the design team. We talked in my breakout room, I think Jane mentioned the point about language and the fact that all these meetings are in English, but what would it mean if they were in Arabic? Who else would be able to participate? Who else would be able to share their experiences and contribute? Suggest ideas for decolonizing education. We should also, again, think about the languages and terms that are used in the program design and how they can be exclusionary and sometimes just quite derogatory as well when we think of people of beneficiaries or the field. And to do, obviously, if you want to be radically inclusive, this does mean changing the ways that you design programs. If we wanted to do multilingual training events, webinars, you know, we need to employ translators to do that, so that can enable all to meaningfully participate. And just thinking about when you're working, maybe if you work for a donor or an international organization, or you're working with community-based or refugee-led organization, like how much is there co-creation, and how much dialogue is there really is feasible, is actually happening. And then again, thinking about visibility. So again, if you are working for like a local organization, how much visibility are you giving to the young people, or the crisis affected people in your organization? How much recognition are they getting for their work, and how are they being positioned? And their final point in the framework talks about speaking to the future. And one of the things that I've been working with a group of people with in the education and emergencies sector is around this idea of having a task team around talking about some of these issues, because there's lots and lots of task teams, and I'm sure like just in Greece with all the coordination, and you know there's sessions around everything, but when it comes to addressing things like racism and decolonizing structures, we don't often find those spaces. They're harder to come by, which means it suggests that there's a value in doing this work, or it's not valued. And then also just trying to see as much as possible how you can advocate for the changes that communities want to see today. And again, this move away from kind of single sector solutions. We know that for young people to engage in education, it's not just about providing a classroom. There's lots of other things that are going on that need to be considered in the design to really bring or enable all young people, particularly marginalised young people, to access. And then also thinking about, I know we've got some academics and institutions on this call, but just also thinking about opportunities again to tap into co-designing and collaborating with research, universities, colleges, and at the same time for those people in those positions not to automatically assume that people affected by crisis need to be capacity built, to draw on people's strengths and recognise learning as a two-way process. Because ultimately we'd like to see, I like to see that the next generation of humanitarian responders should be coming from people who actually have lived experience of crisis. And so concluding thoughts, we know 2020 was a year of, you know, the black square, bold statements around and commitments to radically rethink and address the kind of prevalence of racism and power imbalances and inequity. For me, I've really lent into the literature around decoloniality and think that if it's applied in a programmatic space, this really is kind of anti-racism in action. And because it's kind of committed to radical inclusion, it really benefits everyone. And if we build programs that way, we end up having better programs which serve people. And so if we want to kind of to do this well, then we need to get to work decolonizing our practices. I will share with Olivia actually some of the resources for this presentation, but also if you'd like to reach out, you can connect with me on Twitter, my email, and also just to say that I will be launching some courses in September 2021 around decolonial and socially just research methods, and a more of an in-depth course around equity-based program design. Today was just a very brief taster of some of the work that you could be doing. And then if anyone is interested in participating in my research, I've also got a link for practitioners and a research link for young people. And so I'm going to finish there. We have about 5 minutes before I have to run and collect my son. I I just wondered if anyone had any other questions or thoughts to share before we go.
I'll have one then, seeing as I do like jumping into silences. Thanks very much for that, Jess. That was really, really interesting. And I just want to say I was quite surprised when I saw the subject of the webinar, because I think that there isn't enough of this kind of webinar or discussion that is the humanitarian sector sort of interrogating itself a little bit, and with a critical race lens, really, and talking about, you know, decoloniality, which is a new word for me today. So thanks for that. I wanted to ask about something. Sorry, I've got Ramadan brain at the moment. I'm fasting, but which makes me a bit slow. But I wanted to ask about what you said around diaspora communities as perhaps like alternatives to the traditional approach of saying, okay, we're going to approach a funder, which we know is, you know, a very specific demographic, very different from the demographic we're serving, and who don't have the experiences and insight necessarily that we would want to see. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So again, as you say, like I think we, like as practitioners, like we do have, you know, when we think about donors, we might go for like traditional donors, often from EU-based institutions. But actually, when we think about like diaspora communities have huge networks, and sometimes it's for example, Nigeria. I'm from London, Nigerian heritage. Nigerian churches fundraise money all the time. I've never ever worked for an NGO that has thought, hang on, we're responding to a crisis in Nigeria. Why don't we connect with some people in the Nigerian community, because they might have a really good idea. Everyone's already sending money back there anyway, but they have all these networks of where people would be happy to donate, or people would be happy to involve, or people have, you know, a really good understanding of the crisis, of the context, of the culture. And so, yeah, when we think, there is some stuff actually, and I can share with you, the name escapes me, but there has been some work around diaspora communities and fundraising, which I think, yeah, we could all look into, not just for fundraising purposes either. I mean, just in terms of just having that kind of culturally relevant and contextual knowledge.
Thank you.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to just put my email in the chat. I would welcome any questions or follow up, and I would also, if you're interested, I'm looking for people to participate in my study, so I will pop those links in as well. But if you do have any questions, or you'd like to connect or find out more about some of this work, I'm always happy to talk.
Thank you so much, Jess. I feel like everyone, like Sammy said, I've got so many questions, but I don't know where to how to say them in a short amount of time. But yeah, thanks. I will send as well. I can send these links as well in an email to everyone. So if you need to go quickly, I'll send all of this info to everyone that has come. So yes, just to reassure you that.
Okay, well, look forward to hearing from you all and connecting again. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep running out the door to the nursery.
Bye.
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 Take
Bye.
care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.